How could this have happened? NecroThinker, a supervillain with the power to raise the dead, a monster who has marshaled an army of video zombies and declared war on the modern game industry, is actually the RetroThinker, my friend, a man whose life I believed I had saved. I only ever tried to help him, but now I am forced toward the inevitable conclusion that I may have to fight him. I've already had to fend off his forces twice, most recently at the Zynga Mega Server, and before that at the Call of Duty facility.
Sir, I know we're on the clock here, but speaking of Call of Duty, you may want to check out their new ad campaign. It's causing quite a stir for some reason.
You want to know what the war of the future is going to look like? I don't think the average American grasps how violent war is about to become.
The next few years...
No.
I worry about the guy who wants to hijack all the planes.
You have to be fucking kidding me!
What's the big deal? Who is that guy?
Ollie North.
Who?
Oliver North. Colonel Oliver North is doing commercials for Call of Duty?
Why is that bad?
Why is that... Alright, you know what? NecroThinker's going to have to wait. This requires its own episode.
Is this going to be about politics, sir?
Some of it, yes.
Is that really appropriate? I mean, this is a fun show. You're talking to a fairy right now.
Sometimes you just gotta get serious, Ivan. Roll the credits.
Our universe rests on the uneasy border between two worlds. The world of man, ordinary and stable, and the world of games, imaginative and chaotic. Where these worlds collide, one man is called to stand for reason, maintain the balance, and destroy ignorance. He is the Game OverThinker.
They'll always need men like us. Those who are willing to do.
So this is where we've come to, huh guys? In just under 30 years, we've gone from the gaming medium's public face being cartoon blobs, to cartoon plumbers, to cartoonish exaggerations of one-dimensional militaristic machismo, to actual one-dimensional militaristic machismo, to a real-life deplorable right-wing propagandist considered by some to be a traitor and a war criminal. Seeing Oliver North shilling a Call of Duty game is without question the most despicable video game ad campaign, hell, the most despicable ad campaign period that I can readily recall. It's like hiring O.J. Simpson to hawk cutlery, or Mel Gibson to curate a Holocaust museum. I honestly can't guess what must have been going through Activision's head. There's no shortage of real-life military guys they could have hired as spokespeople who don't bring nearly the same baggage. Are they really just trying to be incendiary and court controversy for controversy's sake? If so, wow, that's incredibly irresponsible in terms of the negative blowback they're inviting against the medium. But what worries me more is the idea that they aren't just being cavalier, that getting into bed with Oliver North and by extension everything else he proudly represents, Activision is staking out a position for itself in the Call of Duty franchise in the very divisive political argument that has often surrounded the military FPS genre. And given that we're talking about the biggest franchise in the most popular genre in the medium, they may have effectively made their position the position of all of modern gaming as far as the mainstream culture's image of the medium is concerned, dragging gaming and gamers into a culture war that most of them probably didn't want to join, and many definitely didn't want to join on the side Activision seems to have taken.
Whoa, sir, you're getting ahead of yourself. You still didn't answer my question. Who is this Oliver North guy?
Right, sorry. Well, fortunately, the show American Dad once did a song parody that pretty much explained the whole thing. But we're not going to show it, because that would probably violate some kind of copyright thing. Anyway. Now, I don't like to assume these kind of things, but judging from the lack of general outcry about this so far, I get the sense that something like a majority of younger gamers specifically don't have any idea who Oliver North is. I mean, hell, I was only like 5 when the important stuff happened, which kind of begs the question as to why he'd be sought out to market video games in the first place, but we'll come back to that. So, Oliver North was the key figure in an international political scandal of the mid-1980s called the Iran-Contra affair. Now, this being a political scandal that ultimately resulted in criminal proceedings, some facts and details remain in dispute, and the whole thing is kind of confusing by design, as political scandals are wont to be, but here's the rundown. From 1979 to 1990, the country of Nicaragua was controlled by an elected communist government called the Sandinistas. They were not super nice guys overall. They were opposed by a loosely affiliated series of rebel counter-revolutionary guerrilla groups collectively referred to as the Contras, who, because they opposed a government that was nominally allied with other communist nations, including the Soviet Union, were the recipients of financing and weapons from the United States, primarily via the Central Intelligence Agency. The Contras, however, were really not super nice guys. Their military operations in Nicaragua were known to include the killing of civilians, burning of towns, theft of property, kidnapping, drug smuggling, the execution of children, and rape. As these issues became more widely known in the US, public opinion began to turn against support for the Contras, and Congress passed a series of amendments between 1982 and 1984, jointly remembered as the Boland Amendment, which forbade the US government from giving any more money to support the Contras. During this same period, there was a military conflict going on in the Middle East between Iran and Iraq called, appropriately enough, the Iran-Iraq War. Despite the fact that Iran had been considered an active enemy of the United States since taking of American hostages in 1979, elements within the Reagan administration became involved in a complicated covert plan to sell weapons to Iran. Yes, really. Now, this is where things start to get weird, because since a whole lot of the stuff that follows is crazy illegal, a lot of people told a lot of different stories. And President Reagan, who you'd think would have to have known a lot about what was really going on, was hospitalized for cancer surgery during the time when many of the key decisions were alleged to have been made. Some of those involved have claimed that the main point of the scheme was to actually sell weapons to a moderate faction within the Iranian government who actually opposed then-leader Ayatollah Khomeini, and that the motive to do so wasn't necessarily to get the money, but to secure this supposedly moderate faction's help in convincing the terrorist group Hezbollah to release a group of American hostages then being held in the neighboring nation of Lebanon.
A lot of these names and places are things I still hear on the news now. Is this stuff still going on?
Pretty much, yeah.
You humans don't do learning so good, do ya? Huh?
No. No, we do not. Anyway, the plan was altered in 1985 to a new proposal made by an NSC aide named Oliver North. North's plan was to stop dealing with the intermediary and sell the weapons directly to Iran at an inflated price. And what did North propose be done with the money? His plan was to give it to the Contras, thus circumventing the Boland Amendment. He was also in talks to begin funneling some of his so-called Project Democracy money to the Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. You should try looking up what he was into. All of this became public knowledge in 1986, and in 1987, after being fired by Reagan, North, along with other members of the administration involved in the scandal, were dragged before the Tower Commission to explain themselves. To this day, it's not really known how many people were really involved and to what degree, as North's secretary Fawn Hall testified to helping him destroy or hide NSC documents pertaining to that information. North was ultimately convicted of 3 felonies, but said convictions were later vacated on appeal owing to complications with limited immunity he had received for offering his testimony in the first place. Others involved in Iran-Contra were indicted and convicted, but those convictions were pardoned by President George H.W. Bush, who had been Reagan's vice president at the time of the scandal. Despite having admitted to committing and having been accused of committing even more actions that many consider to be treasonous, North went on to become an unsuccessful politician, a right-wing talk radio host, an author, and what else, the host of his own show on the notorious Fox News channel. And in case you were wondering if he's had any introspective moments or second-guessing about having sold weapons to an enemy nation in order to give the proceeds to violent drug-running terrorists,
I was saying that all
arms to the Contras.
You want to play the thing again? The reality of life is that America supported democratic movements all over the world, and we did so in Nicaragua, and thank God they won.
You'd be wrong.
And Activision thinks having this guy promote a video game is going to make me more likely to buy it?
Seems that way.
Are they insane?
I kinda hope so. See, if this is just incredible stupidity on Activision's part, that's one thing. But if they're actively aware of who North is, what he represents, etc., and they've used him for these ads to cynically drum up controversy, or worse, because they subscribe to his particular brand of militant right-wing lunacy, that's a big problem. Now, obviously, Activision is free to do business with whoever they want to promote their games, and they're even free to have a certain political philosophy attendant to that promotion. But I'm free to be kind of outraged by it being someone who not only did what Oliver North did, but remains unrepentant about it to this day. And I'm free to be a little bothered about what this says about where the games industry and public perception thereof seems to be heading these days. 4 years ago, in the 5th episode of the Game OverThinker, I talked about what was then an emerging idea in some corners of the political blogosphere that the video game industry was becoming the quote-unquote conservative or right-wing entertainment alternative to the movie industry, aka Hollywood, which is often hilariously viewed as a monolithically left-wing or liberal entity by, well, pretty much by the exact same folks who'd call Oliver North a hero. The basic idea was that the rising popularity of military shooters was partially owed to Hollywood's supposed failure to deliver quote-unquote patriotic action films, and the audience for such fare turning to games instead. At the time, I dismissed that as kind of silly and used it as a jumping-off point for a jokey bit about who various video game characters might vote for. Today, I'm not so sure I would have been so quick to laugh it off, and that kind of creeps me out. For what it's worth, I still don't think video games are right-wing while Hollywood is on the left, but now it's more because I think we're using words incorrectly. What we should be talking about regarding these industries, or at least these specific parts of these industries, is maturity versus immaturity. See, when people complain about the movie industry not making heroic or patriotic action war movies anymore, they tend to be talking about the era when Hollywood's view of war and the military was, well, fundamentally simple and not terribly mature in terms of overall outlook. Oh, plenty of those movies were good, don't get me wrong, but they weren't exactly deep or challenging. Good guys were good, bad guys were bad, men were real men, and war was a simple, noble undertaking for solving problems. In other words, while it has a certain comforting simplicity, it wasn't really a mature or nuanced way of approaching the subject. In the wake of Vietnam and the social upheaval of the 1960s, however, the movie industry began to look at the subject of war with a focus more on the moral gray areas, dubious motivations, and the human cost of big-scale violence. And despite what many political commentators have claimed, I don't look at movies like Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, Full Metal Jacket, Born on the 4th of July, etc., as evidencing some kind of liberal or democratic view of war, but rather simply a more mature view of war. Hollywood, for lack of a better word, grew up. Which is why, after 9/11, instead of producing a slew of one-dimensional, cathartic revenge fantasies in its Age of Terrorism war movies, Hollywood approached the war on terror with caution and introspection. The vast majority of post-9/11 war or political movies were thoughtful or even critical examinations of policy and military action. The film industry and many of its more politically active actors were mercilessly vilified by the right-wing media for this, and it goes without saying that Hollywood probably would have made a lot more money by delivering pandering macho vengeance porn, but instead chose largely not to do that. Video games, on the other hand, went the opposite direction. While Hollywood asked tough questions about the motives for fighting the current wars and about the nature of war itself, video games delivered the chance to take your aggressions out on one-dimensionally evil Middle Easterners and Russians. And yeah, it's easy to look at the contrast here and say movies are left-wing and gaming is on the right, but to me it goes back to a medium that has matured in many respects versus a medium that's still getting there. When it comes to presenting war in a narrative context, video games are for the most part developmentally arrested in the same simplistic place Hollywood was during the John Wayne rah-rah war as heroic macho fantasy era. Gaming just hasn't hit its Apocalypse, Jacket, MASH, etc. intellectual growth spurt yet. But it really does seem like we're going backwards in some respects, doesn't it? I mean, I'm not going to claim that the games industry or the gaming community was ever some great progressive bulwark at some point in the past. I mean, come on. But the strain of anti-progressiveness that seems to have metastasized into a really dark, vile thing does reek of the same sickness that many feel has grown large and troublesome in America's political right wing. I mean, gamers have always had arguments and cliques and silly, clannish tribal behavior, right? But I don't remember it ever being so cruel. Video game fights used to be like Mario vs. Sonic, Genesis vs. SNES, Street Fighter vs. Mortal Kombat, but now more and more it's about race or gender or orientation or any otherness that can be used as an insult in an online deathmatch. That doesn't seem like an improvement to me. And frankly, when you look at the common complaints against the darker elements of modern gaming culture, sexism, racism, homophobia, misogyny, paranoid hatred of quote-unquote feminists, the general consignment of anyone who isn't a white heterosexual cisgendered male to otherness and ridicule, those are all pretty much the exact same problems that seem to afflict the more extreme factions of America's political right. And they're problems that gaming didn't seem to have to this degree until the rise of Xbox Live shooter culture, of which Call of Duty is the longtime vanguard. So to see Oliver North as part of the sales pitch for a Call of Duty game, well, yeah, it's hard not to feel like there might be a tangible link between the worst elements of game culture and the worst elements of political culture. And you know, as much as we joke around and poke fun at the aesthetic and narrative sensibilities of gaming in the recent past, the garish, colorful cartoon mascots and pulp sci-fi tomfoolery of the 80s, the Japanese-dominated, neon-haired, overdressed, gender-ambiguous figures of the 90s, somehow that all seems so much more welcoming and diverse to me than what's increasingly the central image of the industry today. One of the things that kept me engaged in the video game culture during the lean years when I wasn't playing nearly as much as I would have liked to was that for a while it seemed like one of the few genuinely progressive forces in the geek culture, partially owing to pre-Xbox era console gaming existing and growing hand-in-hand with the 80s and 90s anime explosion, which via the medium's popularity in certain dramatically underserved demographics brought a vital infusion of female, minority, and LGBT voices to the nerd universe, where that kind of diversity was sorely, sorely needed. But now we really do seem to be moving away from that more open, diverse, and, if you like, progressive vision of a gaming culture, and towards something that's not only darker and meaner, but also more wedded to arcane ideals of patriarchal chauvinism. And in that respect, the image of Oliver North pitching a Call of Duty game is a depressingly perfect summation of where things seem to be heading. And frankly, while I'll always love video games as an idea and for the good times they've given me so far, if this is the future of the medium, I'm beginning to question if it's worth my while to keep hanging around and hoping that it's going to correct its course.
That was a whole bunch of stuff I wish I didn't have to know. Maybe NecroThinker is right, sir? If this is how low things can get, maybe gaming doesn't deserve to be saved.
No. No, Ivan, there's still good left in gaming. We may have made a mess of it lately, but there's still potential. There's still hope. And so long as there is, we have to fight for it.